Have you ever wondered how quickly an ordinary morning can flip completely upside down? How one moment a family is laughing, chatting, and getting ready for the day, and the next, everything spirals into chaos. And here's a chilling thought. How well do we really know what's happening inside the homes that look perfectly normal from the outside? Before we dive into this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join the channel, because cases like this don't just tell stories, they uncover hidden truths that most people never see coming. April Holt was known by friends, neighbors, and family as someone who held her household together like glue. She was a devoted mom, a steady presence, and the type of woman who always made sure her kids were sorted before worrying about herself. To those around her, April represented stability, the kind of parent who showed up to school events, kept routines tight, and tried her absolute best to give her children a safe and loving environment. From the outside looking in, her life seemed pretty solid, almost textbook normal. She lived in a modest home, balancing daily responsibilities, raising her children, and trying to keep life running smoothly despite the usual stresses that come with parenting. Her relationship with her children was often described as close-knit. April was particularly protective of her youngest son, Denzel. Friends would later say she doted on him, making sure he felt supported, cared for, and safe. Denzel, in return, shared a strong emotional connection with his mother. Like many young boys, he saw her as his protector, his comfort zone, and the person he trusted above anyone else. Their bond was the kind that seemed unbreakable, filled with morning check-ins, casual chats, and the small everyday moments that quietly build family connections. On the surface, the household moved through life with familiar rhythms. School mornings followed predictable patterns. Breakfast routines, preparing school bags, quick reminders about homework, and those rushed but warm exchanges families experience before stepping out into the day. Nothing about the environment suggested danger or instability. Neighbors described the family as polite and relatively quiet. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban home trying to navigate the chaos of modern life. But, as many investigators and behavioral experts would later reflect, sometimes the most ordinary settings can hide the most unexpected crises. And that's exactly what began to unfold on what started as a completely peaceful morning. The day began like countless others. The household stirred awake, routines kicked into gear, and there was no immediate sign that anything was about to go pear-shaped. April moved through her normal responsibilities, interacting with her children, preparing for the day ahead, and maintaining the appearance of calm control. Then, without warning, that calm shattered. What began as a regular family morning quickly spiraled into a life-changing emergency that would shock not only the household, but eventually draw the attention of investigators, medical personnel, and an entire community. The shift from routine to crisis happened so suddenly that those present would later struggle to explain how events escalated so quickly. Moments that seemed ordinary would soon be examined under intense scrutiny. Conversations, sounds, and small details that once felt meaningless would become critical pieces of a much larger and darker puzzle. Among those present that day was Denzel. As a young child, he found himself witnessing fragments of events he couldn't fully understand at the time. Children often pick up on more than adults realize, and what Denzel heard that day would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation. At first, his recollections seemed like confused memories from a traumatic morning, but as authorities began reconstructing the timeline, investigators realized that Denzel may have overheard something that didn't quite align with the initial explanations surrounding the emergency. Families often assume children don't fully process adult conflicts or crises, but psychological experts frequently warn that kids absorb far more than they're given credit for. In Denzel's case, small fragments of overheard words, sounds, and emotional tension would slowly transform into potential evidence. As authorities dug deeper into what unfolded inside that seemingly normal home, the questions began piling up. Was this truly an unpredictable medical emergency, or was there something more complicated lurking beneath the surface? Neighbors, relatives, and community members struggled to reconcile the April they thought they knew with the growing uncertainty surrounding the incident. People who had once described her as dependable, nurturing, and calm now found themselves grappling with unsettling doubt. And investigators knew one thing for certain: behind closed doors, families can experience dynamics that outsiders rarely see. As the timeline continued to unravel, authorities would increasingly focus on Denzel's perspective. His innocent presence inside the home during those critical moments made him both a vulnerable witness and potentially the only person who heard everything that truly happened. But what Denzel overheard that day would later raise disturbing questions investigators couldn't ignore.
What really happens behind closed doors when arguments spiral out of control? How many heated disputes between couples seem like normal relationship drama until something suddenly turns deadly serious? And here's a confronting question: how often do children become silent witnesses to moments adults never imagined anyone else could hear? Before we unpack this disturbing timeline, make sure you hit subscribe and join our community, because these stories don't just explore crime, they expose the hidden warning signs most people overlook. The morning inside April's home began carrying tension that few outsiders would ever notice. What looked like another ordinary day slowly started building pressure beneath the surface. Investigators would later piece together that conversations between April and Donovan had been strained in the hours leading up to the incident. At first, their interactions seemed like the kind of domestic disagreements many couples experience. Raised voices, frustration, and emotional exchanges are sadly common in households across the US, UK, and Australia. Arguments that neighbors might dismiss as typical relationship rows or domestic spats. But according to later statements and timeline reconstructions, this argument wasn't just minor bickering. Something about this confrontation felt heavier, more intense, and emotionally charged. The disagreement reportedly escalated inside the home, with voices growing louder and the tone shifting from frustration to something far more volatile. Investigators would later try to determine exactly what triggered the confrontation, but like many domestic disputes, the root cause remained blurred by conflicting accounts and missing details. Inside the house, young Denzel was nearby. Children often become accidental witnesses during adult conflicts, quietly absorbing sounds, words, and emotional signals they don't fully understand. According to later recollections, Denzel overheard portions of the argument unfolding between April and Donovan. Raised voices carried through the home, fragments of conversation breaking through walls and hallways. For a child, hearing parents or guardians argue can be frightening enough, but behavioral specialists would later explain that children frequently remember specific emotional tones, sudden silences, and changes in atmosphere more vividly than adults realize. As the argument intensified, Denzel reportedly heard tension building, voices overlapping, emotional stress rising, and the sound of confrontation reaching a peak. Then something happened that would later become one of the most chilling moments in the timeline. The noise suddenly stopped. Investigators would later focus heavily on this unexplained silence. Domestic disputes usually fade gradually, voices lower, doors close, or one person leaves the room. But in this case, the sudden and complete quiet created immediate concern. For Denzel, the abrupt silence felt confusing and unsettling. Moments earlier, the home had been filled with loud voices and emotional intensity. Now, everything had gone eerily still. Silence inside a house can sometimes be louder than arguments themselves. At first, Denzel reportedly hesitated. Children often struggle to interpret whether silence means conflict has ended or whether something has gone terribly wrong. But as minutes passed without hearing his mother respond or move around the house, anxiety began creeping in. The normal household sounds, footsteps, conversation, background noise had vanished completely. Eventually, Denzel made a decision that would later place him at the center of the investigation's emotional core. He went to check on April. What he found would become one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in the entire case. Denzel reportedly located his mother unresponsive inside the home. For a child, encountering such a scene can be deeply traumatic and confusing. Emergency experts often explain that children in crisis situations don't immediately understand the seriousness of medical emergencies. They may try to wake a parent, call out their name, or simply freeze in fear, unsure of what to do next. At some point, emergency services were contacted. The exact details of how the call was made would later become part of investigative review. But by the time responders were dispatched, valuable minutes had already passed. Paramedics and first responders rushed toward the residence, unaware they were heading into a situation that had already crossed a devastating threshold. Emergency response teams are trained to act fast, stabilize victims, and preserve life whenever possible. But sometimes, despite rapid dispatch and professional medical intervention, certain emergencies reach a point where saving a victim becomes impossible. As responders entered the home, they immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Medical personnel began assessment procedures, but the signs confronting them suggested the crisis had progressed beyond early intervention. Outside the home, the environment remained deceptively calm. Neighbors had no idea that inside the house, a family tragedy had already unfolded. The contrast between quiet suburban normality and the devastating emergency happening behind closed doors would later shock the entire community. Investigators would soon arrive alongside emergency teams, beginning the process of documenting the scene, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the final moments leading to April's collapse. And as authorities began asking questions, one reality became painfully clear. The only person who may have heard the full argument, the sudden silence, and the immediate aftermath was a young child still trying to process what he had witnessed. And when emergency responders arrived, the situation was already beyond saving.
How do families cope when a medical emergency suddenly turns into a fight for survival? What happens when doctors deliver news so devastating it changes a family forever? And here's a haunting question. How often do early explanations during tragedies turn out to be completely wrong? Before we dive into this emotionally heavy chapter, make sure you subscribe and stick with us, because these cases reveal how quickly truth can shift when investigators look deeper beneath the surface. Emergency crews worked frantically as April was rushed from her home toward the hospital. The journey itself was filled with urgency, flashing lights cutting through early morning streets while paramedics fought to stabilize her condition. Situations like this are often described by emergency responders as a race against time. Every second counts, every decision matters, and outcomes can change in an instant. For families following behind or waiting anxiously at hospitals, those minutes feel like hours, filled with dread and desperate hope. When April arrived at the emergency department, doctors immediately began intensive life-saving procedures. Medical teams are trained to move fast during critical trauma responses, coordinating specialists, running scans, and monitoring vital functions simultaneously. Hospital staff worked around the clock, attempting to reverse the catastrophic damage her body had suffered. Machines supported her breathing, medications were administered, and neurological testing began as doctors tried to determine the extent of her injuries. But as hours passed, the prognosis grew increasingly grim. Neurological specialists conducted detailed examinations, testing brain activity and response reflexes. In cases involving severe head trauma or oxygen deprivation, doctors must determine whether brain function can recover or whether irreversible damage has occurred.
These evaluations are deeply clinical but emotionally devastating, especially when families must sit nearby waiting for updates they dread hearing. Eventually, medical staff delivered the diagnosis no family is ever prepared to receive. April was declared brain dead. Brain death is a medical and legal determination that indicates complete and irreversible loss of brain function. It is not simply unconsciousness or coma. It means the brain has permanently stopped functioning. For loved ones, this distinction can feel confusing and overwhelming. Machines may still keep the body alive temporarily, creating a painful illusion of survival, but medically, recovery is no longer possible. When doctors explained the situation to April's family, emotional shock quickly spread through the hospital waiting area. Relatives struggled to process the news, grappling with disbelief, grief, and unanswered questions. Family members described feeling like the world had suddenly stopped spinning. Moments earlier, they were hoping for recovery. Now they were confronting irreversible loss. Situations like this often trigger waves of emotional responses: anger, confusion, heartbreak, and desperate searching for explanations. Some relatives reportedly questioned how a domestic argument could escalate into such catastrophic medical consequences. Others focused on supporting young Denzel, who had already experienced trauma far beyond what any child should endure. Hospital staff and grief counselors frequently assist families during moments like these, helping them navigate emotional collapse while explaining complex medical realities. Meanwhile, law enforcement began reviewing the circumstances surrounding April's collapse. Initial observations suggested there were no obvious signs of forced entry, external attackers, or clear evidence of criminal violence. Early responding officers sometimes rely on available physical evidence, witness statements, and visible injury patterns to determine whether incidents appear accidental, medical, or suspicious. In April's case, preliminary assessments reportedly leaned toward labeling the event as an accidental domestic incident. Without immediate forensic indicators pointing toward homicide, investigators initially treated the situation as a tragic but non-criminal emergency. Unfortunately, early classifications like this can influence investigative urgency, determining whether full forensic teams are deployed immediately or whether cases receive routine review. Across the US, UK, and Australia, criminal justice experts have warned that domestic incidents sometimes get prematurely categorized when evidence appears unclear during early response stages. Investigators must balance speed with accuracy, but early assumptions can occasionally delay deeper analysis. Cases involving internal family conflicts are especially complex because they often rely heavily on witness testimony and subtle forensic findings that may not appear obvious at first glance. For April's family, the accidental ruling created emotional tension. Some relatives felt the explanation did not fully align with what they believed had happened inside the home. Grief often drives families to search for answers, replaying events repeatedly while trying to understand how ordinary conflict could end in fatal tragedy. Loved ones sometimes notice small inconsistencies or behavioral clues investigators initially overlook. As days passed, funeral preparations and grief rituals began surrounding the family. Public sympathy grew as friends and community members offered support, but beneath the mourning process, uncertainty quietly lingered. Certain family members recordedly struggled to accept the official narrative. Emotional instincts, personal observations, and lingering doubts created internal conflict within the grieving circle. Experts often explain that family members closest to victims sometimes notice subtle patterns or warning signs that formal investigations miss during early stages. Emotional intuition alone does not prove wrongdoing, but it frequently drives loved ones to push authorities for deeper reviews, second autopsies, or expanded forensic testing. And inside April's grieving family, one voice refused to stay silent. Because sometimes grief doesn't just demand closure, it demands truth. How well do we really know the relationships unfolding behind closed doors? How often do friends, neighbors, or even family members see a couple that seems perfectly fine on the surface, only to later discover something deeply troubling was simmering underneath? And here's the real kicker. How many warning signs get brushed off as just relationship drama until it's way too late? Before we unpack this emotionally layered chapter, make sure you hit that subscribe button and stick around, because cases like this show how perception can sometimes be miles away from reality, and understanding those gaps might help someone recognize danger before it spirals out of control. From the outside looking in, April and Donovan appeared to share what many described as a typical family relationship. Friends saw them attending gatherings, sharing parenting responsibilities, and maintaining what looked like a stable household. In communities across the US, the UK, and Australia, it's not unusual for couples to present a united front socially, keeping personal conflicts tucked away where outsiders rarely get a proper glimpse. People often describe these relationships as solid, normal, or just another busy family juggling life. And by most public accounts, April and Donovan fit that mold. But as investigators and relatives would later discover, public perception can sometimes be a carefully managed facade, a polished version of reality that hides deeper emotional struggles. Over time, subtle stories began surfacing from people who had observed moments of tension between the couple. Some friends reportedly noticed arguments that seemed to escalate quickly, while others described Donovan as occasionally displaying controlling tendencies during social interactions. Relationship experts frequently explain that control doesn't always appear in obvious or explosive forms. Sometimes it surfaces through small behavioral cues, dominating conversations, monitoring communication, or subtly influencing a partner's decisions in ways outsiders might overlook or dismiss as personality quirks. Relatives also began reflecting on past gatherings, recalling instances where April appeared quieter than usual, or where disagreements between the pair seemed to linger beneath forced smiles. In hindsight, those moments started raising eyebrows. It's easy for loved ones to rationalize conflict when they want to believe a relationship is healthy, often chalking arguments up to stress, parenting pressures, or everyday relationship hiccups. Many families in Tier 1 countries have shared similar reflections after tragedies, describing how warning signs can blend into normal domestic disagreements until patterns become impossible to ignore. Investigators often rely heavily on these retrospective observations, piecing together behavioral timelines that help reveal whether emotional stress or controlling dynamics existed long before incidents escalate into violence. Some acquaintances reportedly suggested that Donovan occasionally demonstrated jealousy or possessiveness, behavioral traits that can sometimes escalate when combined with unresolved conflict. Criminologists studying domestic violence repeatedly highlight that patterns of control often evolve gradually, making them difficult to detect early on. Victims themselves may downplay concerns, hoping situations improve or fearing consequences of speaking out. Friends and relatives, meanwhile, may hesitate to interfere, believing it's not their place to step into private relationship matters. The tricky part, as experts frequently point out, is that toxic dynamics don't always present as constant chaos. Many relationships cycle through calm and conflict, creating emotional confusion that keeps warning signs buried beneath moments of affection or stability. As family members revisited memories following April's medical emergency, several began noticing behavioral patterns that once seemed insignificant, conversations that felt tense, disagreements that ended abruptly, and emotional shifts that seemed slightly off suddenly took on new meaning. Psychological specialists explain that trauma often triggers retrospective clarity, where past events are re-examined under a completely different emotional lens. What once felt like minor domestic stress can begin to resemble a troubling pattern when viewed alongside tragic outcomes. Investigators frequently encourage families to share these reflections because behavioral history can help establish whether violence was spontaneous or part of a longer emotional escalation. Meanwhile, community members expressed shock, struggling to reconcile the image of a seemingly normal household with the devastating events that unfolded. Cases like this often leave neighbors and friends questioning their own instincts, wondering if they missed signs that could have prompted earlier intervention. Across Western communities, domestic violence awareness campaigns increasingly stress the importance of recognizing subtle behavioral control, emphasizing that stability on the outside doesn't always guarantee safety behind closed doors. As law enforcement and relatives continued examining April and Donovan's relationship timeline, emotional testimonies, social interactions, and behavioral recollections began forming a more complicated picture. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that relationships rarely break down overnight. Instead, they often unravel through layers of stress, control, and unresolved conflict that quietly build over time. And as relatives started comparing memories, sharing private concerns, and reevaluating past interactions, a chilling realization slowly surfaced. The relationship they believed they understood might have contained warning signs nobody fully recognized until it was way too late. Because sometimes the most dangerous environments aren't the ones that look chaotic, they're the ones that appear perfectly normal. And as relatives began revisiting past events, certain patterns started to emerge. How makes a grieving family member refuse to accept an official explanation? How often do loved ones sense something isn't adding up long before investigators circle back for a second look? And here's the unsettling question. When authorities call a tragedy an accident, how hard is it for families to challenge that conclusion without being brushed off as emotional or in denial? Before we break down this critical turning point, make sure you hit subscribe and stick around, because cases like this show how persistence, instinct, and courage from family members sometimes become the very thing that forces hidden truths into the light. In the days following April's death, while relatives struggled through shock and grief, one person found herself unable to shake a growing feeling that something about the official explanation didn't sit right. Jamie, a close family member deeply connected to April's life and routine, began replaying every detail she could remember, from conversations to behavior patterns, searching for answers that the accident narrative simply didn't provide. Grief can cloud judgment, but it can also sharpen instincts. And for Jamie, those instincts were screaming that the situation deserved a deeper look. She reportedly began asking questions others felt too overwhelmed or hesitant to voice, revisiting the timeline of events, analyzing inconsistencies in statements, and quietly gathering pieces of information that might help explain how a domestic escalation could enter into fatal injuries. Across communities in the US, UK, and Australia, family-led investigations often begin exactly like this, not through formal detective work, but through persistent curiosity and emotional determination, sometimes dismissed by authorities as families struggling to accept loss. But Jamie wasn't just venting frustration. She started piecing together observations that made her doubt the accident theory more and more. She reportedly questioned the physical nature of April's injuries, wondering whether they aligned with what she was being told happened inside the home. She also began scrutinizing Donovan's behavior before and after the incident, paying attention to emotional reactions, inconsistencies, and subtle details that can easily slip past initial investigators but stand out sharply to those who know victims intimately. Friends and relatives often hold mental archives of behavioral patterns, how someone normally reacts under stress, how they speak during conflict, and how their emotional tone shifts when something feels off. Jamie allegedly compared Donovan's responses to her understanding of his past behavior, and according to later discussions among family members, she felt those reactions raised serious red flags. Determined not to let her concerns be dismissed as grief-driven speculation, Jamie reportedly began pressing authorities for a deeper review of the case. Families who challenge early accident classifications often face uphill battles, as law enforcement must rely on forensic evidence rather than emotional testimony. Still, persistent pressure from relatives has historically reopened countless investigations worldwide, forcing additional autopsies, forensic reanalysis, and witness re-interviews. Jamie allegedly contacted investigators multiple times, asking them to re-examine medical reports, re-evaluate witness timelines, and consider whether the situation warranted a full criminal investigation rather than a closed accidental case. Law enforcement professionals often acknowledge that family members can notice details outsiders miss, especially in domestic settings where emotional and behavioral histories matter as much as physical evidence. Jamie's determination reportedly placed increased scrutiny on the original investigation, prompting discussions among detectives about whether early assumptions might have overlooked critical details. Meanwhile, her personal investigation extended beyond conversations with authorities. She reportedly reached out to friends, neighbors, and extended family members, gathering accounts of April and Donovan's relationship dynamics, looking for patterns that might explain whether tension or control had existed behind closed doors. Emotional persistence like this can create uncomfortable friction between grieving families and investigators, but it also serves as a powerful catalyst for truth when early conclusions fail to satisfy those closest to the victim. Jamie's growing suspicions also placed emotional strain on the family itself. Some relatives struggled between wanting closure and fearing that reopening the investigation would prolong their grief. Others quietly supported her efforts, sharing doubts they had been afraid to voice publicly. Family investigations often fracture emotional unity, forcing loved ones to confront uncomfortable possibilities about people they once trusted. Across Tier 1 countries, experts note that domestic violence cases frequently surface through persistent relatives who refuse to accept convenient explanations, often uncovering hidden histories of conflict or abuse long after initial investigations close. As Jaime continued pressing for answers, investigators reportedly faced increasing pressure to re-evaluate evidence, re-interview witnesses, and consider forensic reanalysis that might either confirm or challenge the accident ruling. Her determination transformed grief into advocacy, pushing authorities to look deeper into a case that might otherwise have faded quietly into closure. Because sometimes justice doesn't begin with detectives or forensic breakthroughs. Sometimes it begins with a family member who simply refuses to stop asking questions. And as Jaime continued digging into the past, investigators slowly realized her suspicions might uncover details nobody had fully examined before. What happens when medical evidence starts telling a different story than the one originally reported? How often do investigators discover that timelines, the very backbone of any case, don't line up as neatly as they first appeared? And here's a question that sends chills through even seasoned detectives. When someone's account of events begins shifting, is it confusion, panic, or something far more calculated? Before we dive into this critical forensic turning point, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because cases like this reveal how science, behavior, and timing can completely reshape what we think we know about truth. As medical examiners conducted deeper evaluations into April's injuries, specialists began carefully documenting trauma patterns, bruising distribution, and neurological damage. Forensic pathology isn't just about identifying cause of death. It involves reconstructing how injuries occurred, estimating force levels, and determining whether physical trauma aligns with reported events. Across the US, UK, and Australia, forensic experts often describe this process as assembling a silent witness, where the body itself reveals details that victims can no longer explain. Early reports initially supported the possibility of a domestic accident occurring during a heated argument. However, as specialists reviewed April's injuries more thoroughly, subtle inconsistencies reportedly began emerging. Certain trauma patterns appeared more severe than what would typically result from a single accidental accidental fall or isolated physical struggle. Medical professionals analyzed impact angles, internal bleeding patterns, and neurological damage to determine whether the damage aligned with Donovan's version of events. At the same time, investigators began reconstructing the timeline leading up to April's medical collapse. Timelines are critical in criminal investigations because they establish opportunity, intent, and behavioral sequencing. Detectives examined phone activity, witness recollections, emergency call timestamps, and estimated injury windows based on medical findings. Initially, Donovan's statements described a rapid escalation of conflict, followed by an accidental injury. But as investigators compared his timeline with medical assessments, certain gaps reportedly started appearing. Some details about when April lost consciousness didn't perfectly align with neurological damage estimates. Forensic neurologists often use swelling progression, oxygen deprivation timelines, and internal bleeding indicators to estimate when fatal injuries likely occurred. When those estimates fail to match witness statements, investigators begin questioning whether events unfolded exactly as described. Meanwhile, Donovan's multiple statements during early questioning were carefully reviewed by behavioral analysts trained to detect inconsistencies in narrative recall. It's not uncommon for witnesses or suspects to provide slightly varying recollections during stressful situations, but law enforcement pays close attention when changes affect critical time markers or injury explanations. Investigators reportedly noticed subtle shifts in Donovan's retelling of the argument, differences in how physical contact was described, how long April remained conscious, and how quickly emergency assistance was sought. Behavioral analysts also evaluate body language patterns, emotional tone, and verbal phrasing during interviews. While these observations cannot independently prove guilt, they often guide investigators toward areas requiring deeper forensic validation. Experts frequently explain that truthful recollections tend to remain structurally consistent, even if minor details change, while fabricated or partially withheld accounts sometimes shift as individuals attempt to adapt to emerging evidence. As Donovan's statements were cross-referenced against forensic reports, digital timestamps, and medical analysis, investigators reportedly found themselves re-evaluating the accident classification more seriously. Meanwhile, forensic review teams expanded their analysis beyond injury reconstruction. Specialists examined potential defensive wounds, signs of repeated trauma, and evidence suggesting whether physical force may have been applied multiple times rather than in a single accidental moment. Domestic violence research across Tier 1 nations has consistently shown that fatal incidents often involve escalating physical confrontations rather than isolated accidental injuries. As forensic teams continued their evaluation, timeline reconstruction became increasingly complex. Investigators attempted to pinpoint when the argument began, when physical violence may have occurred, and when Donovan contacted emergency services. Small discrepancies in these timeframes can drastically reshape legal interpretation, determining whether an incident qualifies as accidental, reckless, or intentional harm. For families and investigators alike, these evolving findings created emotional tension and investigative urgency. If Donovan's version of events proved inaccurate, it could mean April's injuries were not the result of a tragic accident, but something far more disturbing. Community members following the case struggled to process the possibility that early conclusions might have overlooked critical forensic evidence. Across Western legal systems, cases have repeatedly demonstrated how evolving medical reviews can transform investigations long after initial reports are filed. As detectives, forensic specialists, and behavioral analysts continued comparing injury science with Donovan's statements, pressure mounted to determine whether the truth had been hidden behind confusion or deliberately altered narrative. Because when timelines start shifting, entire cases can unravel, exposing truths nobody expected to confront. And as investigators prepared to finalize their forensic reassessment, one particular detail buried inside the medical findings would soon cast serious doubt on the accident theory.
How often do investigators circle back on a case they thought they understood? What makes law enforcement hit the brakes, reassess evidence, and start asking tougher questions they didn't ask the first time around? And here's the unsettling thought. How many cases only change direction because someone refuses to let authorities close the book too soon? Before we dig into this investigative turning point, make sure you subscribe and stay locked in, because cases like this reveal how truth doesn't always arrive in a straight line. Sometimes it only emerges when detectives decide to listen a little closer. As pressure from April's family intensified and forensic concerns continued surfacing, law enforcement reportedly initiated a reassessment of the entire case. Reassessments are not uncommon in domestic incidents, especially when new medical interpretations or family testimony raises red flags. Investigators began reviewing original police reports, emergency response records, and witness accounts to determine whether any critical details had been overlooked during the initial classification. Across the US, UK, and Australia, modern policing increasingly recognizes that domestic violence cases often present as ambiguous emergencies at first glance, requiring layered review to uncover underlying patterns. Detectives reportedly returned to the neighborhood to conduct follow-up interviews with neighbors and nearby residents. Witness canvassing is a crucial investigative technique, allowing authorities to capture environmental context, timeline verification, and behavioral observations surrounding incidents. Neighbors sometimes notice sounds, movements, or interactions that household members may not fully disclose. Investigators allegedly asked residents whether they had heard arguments, disturbances, or unusual activity leading up to April's medical emergency. Some neighbors reportedly described hearing raised voices during the morning confrontation, though domestic disputes can be difficult to interpret from outside walls, where sounds become distorted and incomplete. Others provided observations about Donovan's demeanor immediately following the incident, recounting whether he appeared frantic, composed, or emotionally detached. Behavioral context like this can guide investigators toward understanding emotional escalation patterns. Meanwhile, detectives also expanded interviews to include friends, relatives, and acquaintances familiar with April and Donovan's relationship history. Domestic violence specialists frequently emphasize that victims often reveal concerns indirectly through conversations with trusted individuals long before incidents escalate into physical harm. Investigators reportedly asked whether April had ever mentioned fear, tension, or controlling behavior within the relationship. Domestic violence risk factor analysis became a central component of the reassessment. Criminologists and victim advocacy organizations across Tier 1 nations have developed detailed models identifying behavioral warning signs linked to escalating domestic violence. These include patterns of control, emotional isolation, jealousy, verbal intimidation, and sudden relationship volatility. While none of these factors alone confirm criminal violence, they help investigators assess whether fatal incidents could represent the final stage of prolonged emotional or physical conflict. Detectives reportedly examined whether Donovan exhibited any known behavioral risk indicators. They analyzed financial dependency patterns, communication monitoring behaviors, emotional volatility, and relationship power dynamics. Experts frequently stress that domestic violence is rarely defined solely by physical assault. Psychological control and escalating emotional conflict often precede fatal confrontations. Law enforcement agencies in Western countries increasingly train officers to recognize these behavioral markers during domestic incident investigations, understanding that early intervention can prevent tragedies. As interviews expanded, investigators allegedly noticed recurring concerns shared by multiple family members. These included recollections of arguments, behavioral tension, and emotional strain within the household. While such testimonies require forensic support to influence criminal charges, consistent patterns can significantly shift investigative focus.
Meanwhile, detectives began coordinating with forensic specialists to reevaluate injury interpretations alongside behavioral context. Combining medical evidence with relationship history can strengthen investigative direction, helping authorities determine whether physical injuries resulted from spontaneous conflict or escalating abuse patterns. The reassessment reportedly shifted the investigation from viewing April's death as a possible accidental tragedy toward considering potential criminal liability. This shift required additional forensic testing, expanded witness interviews, and consultation with domestic violence experts trained to evaluate psychological dynamics surrounding fatal family incidents. Across Western legal systems, case classification often marks the moment investigations intensify, triggering deeper scrutiny of suspects and evidence timelines. For April's family, this investigative shift offered cautious hope that their concerns were finally being taken seriously. However, reassessments also bring emotional turmoil, forcing loved ones to revisit painful memories while confronting the possibility that the truth may be far darker than originally believed. Community observers began following the case more closely, recognizing that domestic tragedies often carry hidden layers that only emerge through persistent investigative effort. As detectives moved forward with their new investigative direction, they faced a daunting reality familiar to law enforcement worldwide. Domestic incidents rarely involve independent witnesses, surveillance coverage, or clear forensic scenes. Events unfolding inside private homes often rely heavily on conflicting testimony, circumstantial evidence, and behavioral reconstruction. Proving exactly what occurred inside those walls would require meticulous forensic validation, legal precision, and unwavering investigative persistence, because sometimes cases change direction not because new evidence suddenly appears, but because investigators finally start listening to the voices that refused to be ignored. But proving what truly happened inside that home would become incredibly difficult.
What happens when an investigation reaches the courtroom, but the truth still feels just out of reach? How do prosecutors build a case when evidence is complex, emotions are raw, and the only people who truly know what happened are either gone or refusing to tell the full story? And here's the question that quietly haunts many domestic tragedy cases. When testimony and forensic evidence collide, how does the justice system decide what counts as truth? Before we step into this legally and emotionally charged chapter, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned, because cases like this reveal how justice isn't always black and white. Sometimes it lives in frustrating shades of gray. As investigators completed their reassessment and compiled forensic findings, attention gradually shifted toward whether criminal charges could realistically be filed against Donovan. In domestic fatality cases across the US, UK, and Australia, prosecutors must evaluate not only whether a death occurred during conflict, but whether available evidence can legally prove intent, recklessness, or criminal negligence beyond reasonable doubt. This burden of proof represents one of the biggest challenges in domestic violence prosecutions. Unlike crimes involving strangers, domestic incidents often unfold behind closed doors, leaving limited independent witnesses and heavily relying on physical evidence, behavioral history, and suspect statements. Prosecutors reportedly examined medical findings, timeline inconsistencies, witness recollections, and behavioral analysis to determine whether Donovan's actions met legal thresholds for charges such as manslaughter, aggravated assault, or homicide. Each potential charge requires specific legal criteria, including proof that injuries were inflicted intentionally or through reckless disregard for safety. The difficulty arises when injuries could plausibly result from both accidental and intentional scenarios, creating legal ambiguity that defense attorneys frequently exploit. Legal experts across Western justice systems often describe domestic fatality cases as some of the most difficult to prosecute, precisely because emotional conflict and physical altercations blur lines between accident and criminal liability. Prosecutors must present clear, consistent narratives supported by forensic certainty. Anything less risks acquittal or case dismissal.
Meanwhile, Donovan's defense reportedly focused on maintaining the accidental nature of the incident, emphasizing lack of eyewitnesses and highlighting inconsistencies or uncertainties within forensic interpretations. Defense strategies in domestic cases frequently center on creating reasonable doubt by questioning injury causation, timeline reconstruction, and emotional context surrounding arguments. Court proceedings or investigatory hearings often become battlegrounds between medical experts presenting competing interpretations of injury mechanics. One forensic specialist might argue trauma patterns indicate intentional force, while another might suggest accidental impact during physical struggle. These expert disagreements can significantly influence jury perception and prosecutorial confidence. Additionally, witness testimony in domestic cases often presents challenges. Family members may offer behavioral observations or suspicions, but courts typically require direct evidence connecting those patterns to the fatal event itself. Emotional testimony, while compelling, cannot replace forensic certainty under strict legal standards. Prosecutors must also consider psychological factors affecting witnesses. Trauma can influence memory recall, timeline accuracy, and emotional presentation during testimony, all of which defense attorneys may challenge aggressively during cross-examination. Across Tier 1 countries, criminal justice analysts frequently note that domestic homicide cases carry higher risks of evidentiary conflict than many other violent crimes, largely because of their private, emotionally volatile nature. As legal review progressed, investigators and prosecutors reportedly faced difficult decisions about whether available evidence could support criminal charges strong enough to survive courtroom scrutiny. Filing charges without sufficient proof risks case collapse, potentially preventing future legal action if acquittal occurs. On the other hand, declining to file charges can leave families feeling justice was never pursued fully. These decisions represent some of the most agonizing choices within prosecutorial systems. For April's family, the legal uncertainty created prolonged emotional strain. They were forced to navigate grief while watching investigators, attorneys, and forensic experts debate interpretations of the worst day of their lives. Families in similar cases often describe legal proceedings as emotionally exhausting, where each hearing or investigatory update reopens trauma without guaranteeing closure. Community members following the case also struggled to understand how complex domestic investigations can become once they enter legal territory. Many assume that forensic findings automatically lead to criminal charges, but in reality, prosecutors must balance strength of evidence, legal thresholds, and likelihood of conviction before proceeding. As hearings, reviews, or investigatory conclusions unfolded, each development carried emotional weight for everyone involved. Even when legal outcomes appear definitive, whether charges are filed, reduced, or declined, domestic fatality cases often leave lingering doubts. Courts determine legal responsibility, but they cannot always reconstruct emotional motivations or fully explain chaotic moments that escalate into irreversible tragedy. Experts frequently explain that justice systems are designed to evaluate evidence, not necessarily provide emotional closure. For families, that distinction can feel painfully incomplete. And as legal proceedings moved toward resolution, one unsettling reality remained clear. Even when courtrooms deliver verdicts or investigative agencies close files, domestic tragedies rarely end with absolute certainty, because sometimes justice answers legal questions, but emotional and moral questions continue echoing long after the final ruling. And even after legal proceedings, unanswered questions can remain. What happens to children when their world shatters in a single moment? How do young minds process trauma they were never meant to witness, let alone survive? And here's the question that lingers long after courtrooms close and investigations end. When domestic tragedy strikes, who carries the emotional scars that never fully heal? Before we step into one of the most emotionally powerful chapters of this story, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because understanding the long-term impact of domestic violence isn't just about crime, it's about the invisible aftermath that families live with for years. In the wake of April's death, the emotional epicenter of the tragedy quickly shifted toward her children, especially Denzel, whose life changed forever in ways no child should ever experience. Psychological experts across the US, UK, and Australia consistently warn that children who witness or are exposed to domestic violence often carry deep emotional trauma that can shape their development, relationships, and mental health well into adulthood. For Denzel, the trauma wasn't just about losing his mother. It involved witnessing events, hearing arguments, and experiencing the terrifying moment of discovering a parent unresponsive. Child trauma specialists describe this type of exposure as complex grief, where loss and shock combine with fear and confusion, creating emotional wounds that can take years, sometimes decades, to fully process. Families coping with domestic tragedy often shift their focus from seeking legal answers to protecting surviving children from long-term psychological harm. Counselors and support networks typically step in to help children navigate grief, survivor guilt, and anxiety that often follows violent or sudden parental loss. Survivors frequently struggle with recurring memories, sleep disturbances, trust issues, and heightened sensitivity to conflict. Experts explain that children in these situations sometimes develop hyper-awareness, constantly scanning environments for emotional or physical threats, a survival mechanism that can impact social relationships and emotional stability later in life. For Denzel and his siblings, rebuilding a sense of normalcy required immense support from extended family members, counselors, and community advocates. Loved ones reportedly worked to preserve April's memory as a loving mother, while helping the children process complex emotions about the circumstances surrounding her death. Families in similar situations often face difficult decisions about how much information children should receive about domestic violence incidents, balancing truth with emotional protection. Meanwhile, the broader community reaction reflected both shock and sorrow. Neighbors, friends, and local support organizations often rally around families after domestic tragedies, offering emotional assistance, financial support, and advocacy resources. Across Tier 1 countries, community responses frequently include vigils, awareness campaigns, and educational programs designed to highlight warning signs of domestic violence. April's case reportedly sparked renewed conversations about recognizing subtle relationship control patterns and encouraging individuals to seek help earlier when conflicts escalate. Domestic violence advocacy groups often use cases like this to emphasize how abuse does not always present as visible physical violence until situations reach catastrophic tipping points. Emotional control, intimidation, and escalating arguments frequently precede fatal outcomes, making early awareness critical. Awareness campaigns also stress the importance of listening to children who may overhear or witness domestic conflict, as their perspectives sometimes reveal hidden patterns adults fail to acknowledge. Experts consistently highlight that children exposed to domestic violence are at statistically higher risk for future emotional challenges, emphasizing the urgent need for early psychological intervention and community support systems. As public discussion around April's case spread, advocacy organizations reinforced messages encouraging neighbors, friends, and relatives to take domestic tensions seriously, rather than dismissing it as private relationship drama. Domestic violence prevention programs across Western communities increasingly stress that domestic violence is not solely a private family matter, but a public safety concern affecting entire communities. For April's family, the emotional journey extended far beyond courtrooms or investigative reports. Grieving families often describe domestic tragedies as events that fracture not only relationships, but entire family structures. Birthdays, holidays, and everyday milestones become emotional reminders of absence, forcing loved ones to rebuild family identity around loss and survival. Children, especially, may struggle to understand how to remember a parent while coping with traumatic circumstances surrounding their death. Community support networks and trauma counseling frequently become long-term necessities rather than temporary assistance. Specialists explain that healing from domestic violence exposure rarely follows a predictable timeline, requiring ongoing emotional care and stable family environments to rebuild trust and security. And while legal proceedings may eventually reach conclusions, the emotional consequences ripple outward indefinitely, shaping how families communicate, bond, and perceive safety. For Denzel and his siblings, April's story became part of their identity, a painful chapter that also serves as a powerful reminder of resilience, support, and the importance of awareness. Advocacy groups often emphasize that children who survive domestic tragedy can become strong voices for prevention and education, transforming trauma into advocacy that helps protect others. Because sometimes the loudest voices for change belong to those who experienced silence, fear, and loss firsthand. Some victims never speak, but their stories reshape awareness, influence prevention, and remind communities why domestic violence can never be ignored. And long after investigations close, verdicts are delivered, and headlines fade, families like April's often continue searching for emotional closure, trying to rebuild lives while carrying memories that never truly disappear. Cases like April's often leave families searching for closure long after investigations end. How safe is a home that looks perfectly normal from the outside? How often do relationships that seem stable actually hide danger lurking just beneath the surface? And here's the chilling question. If tragedy can strike in a household like April's, how many warning signs go unnoticed in homes across the US, UK, and Australia every single day? Before we wrap up this story, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because understanding the invisible red flags in relationships isn't just fascinating, it might just save a life. April's death left an emotional legacy that continues to ripple through her family. For Denzel and his siblings, life has forever been reshaped by trauma, grief, and unanswered questions. Psychologists consistently emphasize that the long-term impact of domestic tragedy extends far beyond immediate loss. It influences behavior, emotional development, and how children perceive safety and trust. For families like April's, that legacy manifests in heightened vigilance, protective instincts, and a drive to recognize danger even when it isn't obvious. Meanwhile, relatives, friends, and community members began revisiting patterns in April and Donovan's relationship. What once seemed like ordinary arguments now appeared to be subtle warning signs, controlling behaviors, emotional volatility, and tension that had been brushed off as just relationship stress. Domestic violence specialists explain that these seemingly minor indicators are often precursors to more serious incidents. Across Tier 1 nations, experts stress that understanding early signs, raised voices escalating unpredictably, isolation of a partner, controlling financial or social behavior, is critical for prevention. Communities that take these red flags seriously often intervene earlier, potentially stopping harm before it escalates. April's case also sparked public conversations about awareness and prevention. Advocacy organizations highlighted the importance of listening to family and children, encouraging neighbors to notice patterns, and reinforcing the message that domestic conflicts are not private matters when safety is at risk. Public campaigns frequently emphasize that prevention requires vigilance, understanding behavioral cues, recognizing subtle control, and acting before tragedy occurs. Experts note that education and awareness can transform communities, ensuring that warning signs aren't dismissed as ordinary stress or relationship drama. Investigators and legal professionals also stressed the broader lessons from April's story. Cases like hers demonstrate how complex domestic incidents can become, especially when initial assessments label tragedies as accidents. When authorities, family members, and communities work together, inconsistencies, red flags, and behavioral histories can be brought into focus, improving both investigative outcomes and public safety awareness. But as we reflect on this story, the most haunting questions remain. Families can grieve, investigators can pursue justice, and communities can advocate for awareness, yet danger can hide in plain sight. how many other households carry silent tension, subtle control, or unrecognized warning signs that never make it into police reports? How often are children like Denzel left to witness things no child should see, while the world outside assumes everything is fine? And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, if tragedy can strike in a home that appeared stable, how often do we overlook the signals that could prevent it? April's story reminds us that safety isn't always visible. Emotional manipulation, subtle control, and escalating tension can lurk behind smiles, social appearances, and tidy homes. And while legal verdicts, forensic reviews, and media coverage provide closure for the public record, the real lessons live in awareness, vigilance, and community action. Families, friends, and neighbors are often the first line of defense, the ones who can notice patterns that authorities might initially miss. Understanding these signs, asking difficult questions, and taking action early can sometimes prevent tragedies before they happen. As we leave this story, let the question linger in your mind. If danger can hide inside a home that appears stable, how often are warning signs overlooked? Because the reality is uncomfortable, but awareness is the first step toward protecting lives, reshaping families, and preventing silent tragedies from repeating.